The last thing out of this chapter that I want to explain is something called a box and whisker plot. And basically what it does is it's just a different way of looking at a normal distribution, and rather than breaking it into the pieces that a normal curve does, they break it up into quarters. So they have the scores that are from the lowest scores up to the upper 25% of the scores up to the 50 percentile, the scores up to the 75th percentile, and then the rest of the scores beyond that. So and the most common thing that you'll hear about is this thing called a interquartile range. So on a normal curve, 68% of the people are the scores in the middle, and there's scores above the average and scores below the average, but if you look at all of them, that's 68%. With an interquartile, we're looking at the middle 50% of the scores. And I know this is a little bit fuzzy to see. I had to blow it up to make it large enough to see. But if you can imagine for just a second that there's this normal distribution, of course they have a better curve than I can draw, and in a normal distribution you still have a mean, and then you have the middle 68% of the scores. Well, with an interquartile range, you have, this is the 25% mark, this is the 75% mark. So it's this piece in the middle, this middle 50%, that they're talking about. And that's how, when they talk about an interquartile range, they talk about most people. The average number of people is something like that. And very often what you'll see is these turned on their side, which I want to get to in just a second. But basically it kind of gives you a picture of the range, the lowest score to the highest score, and how these scores are distributed around the middle. So if we look at this next slide, you have the upper score here, the lower score here, and this has to do with something out of chemistry if I remember correctly. You have what the mean was and the distribution of scores for the interquartile range, the middle 50%. So what you can see is you have a kind of a wide distribution in the middle 50% here, but in this one for calcium, your distribution of the interquartile range is much tighter. That means they're lumped more together around the center. If you remember, we talked about the leptokurtic distribution where you have something that's very tight around the center. Well, this is the same kind of thing that's happening. Of course, you still have your range of upper and lower. If you look at this one, the middle 50% are really tightly bound around the mean, as opposed to something like this. Here's your mean, the middle 50% are very spread out. So what this is just a picture to kind of explain to the reader how the scores are distributed. And that's called a box whisker plot, and that is one of the other more common ones. Personally, I think they're a little difficult to read because you don't see them a lot. I think you see these a lot more in science than you do in anything that you'd have to do with education. But nonetheless, it's something you'll probably come across. This wraps up the end of Chapter 2, and we can start on Chapter 3 next.